This week, we shift gears to figure out what's actually shifting when we hear the phrase shift left. In the news segment, zero logon exploits outrun patch progress. Chrome hits a bounty bump in its recent patch. TikTok swerves into a sometimes factor authentication. Instagram speeds past a buffer. Microsoft ignites a turbo boost for DevOps, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 123, recorded September 28th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Mr. Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Happy Monday, ABC.
Happy Monday, ABC to you also, Mr. John Kinsella.
Man, I don't know anything else that goes in the series beside 1, 2, 3, and ABC, so I'm sort of stuck here.
We can go through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 for all of you good Sesame Street fans out there. That was what was stuck in my head this whole time. And for those of you who are not just busy watching Sesame Street, if you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of these shows, something perhaps security related, submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. It's official. Security Weekly, in partnership with Cyber Risk Alliance, is excited to present Security Weekly Unlocked on December 10th, 2020. This inaugural edition of Security Weekly Unlocked also celebrates Security Weekly's 15th anniversary. Registration will be open soon, but call for speakers is open now. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to submit your speaking session.
Actually, registration's open. I just updated the link this morning, so that hot off the press.
Hot off the press. There we go. So those of you listening to the live stream, go sign up now. Get your single-digit number ticket. Those are the best collector's edition tickets they're going to be.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Speaking of 1, 2, 3, one of the things that's come up in a couple of our conversations over the past couple of episodes has got me thinking about shifting left, because we've kind of skirted around trying to explicitly define what does DevOps mean, DevSecOps mean, because it doesn't matter too much about strict definitions. But there's another common term or common phrase called shift left. But what does that actually mean when we're shifting left? The last 2 weeks, we've been talking about vulnerabilities and finding vulnerabilities. There's a number of vulnerabilities that have been showing up in Microsoft Patch Tuesday, for example. But I want to assert at least or hint that maybe shifting left doesn't really mean let's find vulnerabilities earlier. I think it's going to mean a lot more than that. And I'm going to throw over to, let's see who strikes first. Matt has been talking about this and a little bit of touching that difference between, are you a CISO or a security program going down the governance route or the engineering route? And John, you've taken this from the perspective of a couple of weeks ago. You had a blog post that was pointing out, where does security show up in AWS services, or related to the SDLC? So with this premise, what are we actually shifting when we say shift left? What does that come to mind for you two?
Who's going first? Oh, I guess I broke the silence. So I guess
There we go. You did it.
What are we shifting left? I think we are shifting aspects of security left, but we're also shifting. I think we should be shifting other aspects as well. So, when I think about this topic, right? Everybody's like shift left, DevSecOps. What does that mean? Even some people are like, it's Sec DevOps. I'm like, come on, we can't even get DevOps Sec handled, let alone DevSecOps to say Sec's driving this, because security's not driving aspects of this in most cases, right? This is development, and the development teams and the operational teams trying to improve efficiencies. And I think this is an efficiency play, not necessarily a security play, but security can fit in from an efficiency standpoint if we think about it correctly. Because as we design the requirements for the system, as we design these architectures, security can have inputs earlier in the process as part of this DevSecOps process. And I think if we integrate different types of testing into that new efficient process, then we can also gain efficiencies from a security perspective. But to say security is going to solve all vulnerabilities before we go to production, nah, we're not there. I don't know if we'll ever get there. But if we can be more efficient about how we integrate security in, instead of waiting till the very end or waiting till the stuff's in production and then 3, 6, 9 months later finding this stuff, we'll be better off, but it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, I think I can agree with most of that. The thought that was on my head around this to sort of start with, and it started, I wrote that blog post a while ago, but more frequently on here, I've been ranting or commenting or being depressed about the last 2 weeks about, as we shift left, are we actually getting better? And I think one of the things I'd like to see or think about here is not just so much shifting, we're shifting, as you just said, testing and security and a lot of those implementations to the left. I want to see adding metrics, security metrics, both going left and right, as we put this stuff to the left, are we actually getting an ROI out of this? Are we improving things at all? As we add each thing, we claim to be engineering, right? Most people haven't heard the story. Many, many years ago, I was giving folks a tour of a data center back when I worked in that industry. And this was a bunch of engineers from some space. And at the end, one of the things they asked me was, how do you guys do capacity planning? This is in 98, just for time setting. And they asked me, how do you do capacity planning for how much more cooling or electrical or fiber to bring in, all these type of things? And I just sort of laughed at them, right? Because at that point in time, at that particular data center, we weren't doing engineering planning like that type, like actual engineers, right? I'm not sure around the world, at least in the US, there's a concept of a certified licensed engineer for like building bridges and stuff. In software, we're miles away from that, right? But can we add a little more maturity to this process and bring in a little more actual testing for an engineering point of view of, as we add in a security tool or as we shift to the left or as we do some of these things, can we see some sort of benefit out of that? So then we can go, okay, that's cool. That particular piece gave us an improvement. Can we do more of that? So that's sort of what I'd like to see, not just purely shifting things to the left.
I think you bring up a really good point around metrics, because when I've had these conversations with even the analysts, it's like, okay, guys, what metrics are we going to use to measure success? It could be vulnerabilities because I found them earlier. I'm not sure that's the right metric, because it's not just about vulnerabilities, right? We do have some set of metrics when it comes to release cycles and efficiencies and how quickly we can get things out. There's a velocity set of metrics that I think are important. Mm-hmm. If I can tie those velocity metrics with also maybe how many bugs that were identified were fixed before we push them into production, when you start to tie those two together, I think there are a set of metrics that potentially make sense. And we'd want to measure them, and we'd want to see improvement, John, across those different metrics. That would show us that the process and the shifting these things left actually works.
Yeah, and it has to be useful, right? It's increasing the number of bugs fixed or increasing the number of deployments to production by itself that's a good way to get some high fives, but is that actually improving things? So and I think we're working hopefully at some point in maybe 4 to 6 weeks out, getting a guest on here who's written a few books on the topic of metrics and security. Good friend of yours, Matt. So hopefully we'll be able to get them in and have them talk about some of the stuff at that aspect as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of this, in the spirit of metrics as well, one of the things that prompted me to start thinking about this is that the Cloud Security Alliance recently released a paper about the Egregious 11, which stood out to me just because it's a nice alliterative title. But it's basically looking at roughly about 9 different case studies of breaches over the last year or two, and how they'd apply and how different cloud security controls would apply to that. Now, 2 things kind of stood out to me that you were just talking about. One was metrics. That the metrics in the write-up are mostly about, from a security perspective, the impact and the business impact, at least, of what happened when these breaches occurred. And they're not so much of these were the vulnerabilities or amount of vulnerabilities, but this was the fine, et cetera, and so on. So there's a bit of metric there, but it's also hard to quantify the breach. But the other thing that comes back to also ancient history, even predating 1998 and John's story, was that there was a sentence here that was saying, yet again, security patching process, and they call out reference even after the Morris worm in 1988, still cannot be executed successfully. And they were simply highlighting that patching would have addressed a lot of these breaches. That was one of the major incoming points for these. And so that's where I'm highlighting the idea that if we're shifting left, a lot of it is just kind of showing up instead earlier in the process and helping engineers with basic engineering processes, not just to remind, hey, not just to say at the end, patch your systems, but what's the way we can get system patching or third-party dependency, software composition analysis patching better? And that's where hopefully we do actually see some better tools coming from the security community that are touching into that CI/CD pipeline to address just something as simple as patching. And the other thing that stood out then is just identity and access management. Once again, there's nothing really sexy, there's nothing really crazy or insightful there other than to say apply least privilege, and that predates even 1998 as a security idea. So there's a lot of things that still just need to be done from the very basics before we even talk about how many bugs are we finding and fixing in terms of that as a sort of metric.
Yeah, and we've seen some really good innovation especially on the patching side. We had Accurix on for a webcast last week. They've been on this show where they can actually create the remediation as code and make it part of a pull request. I mean, think about that. From a patching perspective, we've identified a potential gap and a misconfiguration, and here's the code to actually fix it and allow that to get merged into your branch as part of your next release. I mean, that's the beauty and power of DevOps in that environment. However, that means all of the tooling and all those patching processes and all those fixes are actually integrated into the pipeline. And I think that's where the big gap still is. Security vendors will talk shift left, they'll talk DevSecOps, but are they truly embracing the integration into the pipeline to make that a reality? And I think that's still the big gap in where we are from a tooling perspective. But the foundational elements some of those are there in some cases.
They are there. And if I put on a hat of optimism, I'm going to look at hopefully that organizations are able to bring those in and do things like you're describing. Here is our Terraform description of our cloud environment. We can now automatically analyze and remediate problems that we see there. What's still going to be tough if we talking about patch management not being fixed since at least 1988, but still that third-party vendor management. And there is one of the cases, for example, in this report, they just picked up an example of a Dow Jones data breach that was due to a third-party service provider that had sensitive data unsecured. So now we're still going to be able to figure out, and this is where possibly the governance side of things comes in. If you hand over data, or if you contract out data, or you just have a third party handling your data, besides a 100,000 question checklist of a vendor security assessment, how are you going to automatically ensure or get confidence that that data is being secured outside of your network?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I spent a lot of time doing third-party vendor management in the early part of my career, and I know what those questionnaires look like, okay? and I know the answers you get, and then I know all the tracking you have to do, but at the end of the day, breaches can happen that way. And I think that's a very interesting part. And I think that's where the governance side of this, and are there ways to validate that third-party risk? You see solutions continuing to pop up in the market to look at some of the digital risk components and in the interrelationship of third parties and who you're leveraging, and are there risks that are out there? That is a really kind of governance risk management role that not every security team is really embraced in some respects. Compliance might have, because compliance had to. But when you think about it from a CISO perspective, are they really doing that? Or are they, still trying to figure out how to operationalize security in their environments? That's where the differences in the teams. But but to your point, the supply chain, the software bill of materials, understanding those relationships are very important. But I started this in 2003. I mean, here we are 17 years later. We still don't have a handle on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
No, we don't. And that's, go ahead, John.
I think you sort of, you sort of, I don't want to say it's not quite the direct focus, but what's interesting about the CSA doc, the top threats to cloud computing, Egregious, I'm going to screw that up, that one. But I think you sort of nailed it about when you mentioned bring GRC into it, because I think when you look at this at first, you don't think GRC. I didn't. But one of the first things they mentioned is the CSA CCM. And by the way, folks, we have a link to this in the show notes. There's more acronyms in this document. It's 30 pages and probably 300 acronyms. But the CCM is a pretty amazing document that folks over there have been working on for years and years. And John Michael and these guys put it together into this document. I think it's really interesting. As I was reading through it, it starts sort of a little high level and then starts coming down. And really, in a way, what they've done is they put together, at least the way I think of this, they put together almost an academic case study of these breaches, and then broken them down by threat actor, threat vulnerabilities, technical impacts, business impacts, and controls. And the way I was thinking about it is
that's very GRC-ish, by the way, John.
Exactly, you're spot on. Yeah. But the way I was thinking about this is, could I add this into if you're doing a review after a breach in your own company, could you replicate this? And then I'm like, wow, it'd be a lot of work, because you have to actually figure out for each one of those categories which of the different buckets have you hit, not necessarily in a good way, and then at the end is like, I like the end part, the controls. Okay, what controls did we not have? What controls could we add which could have stopped this? What controls did we have which our metrics showed didn't work that well? See how I got that in there? And so I like where they're going at the end, but the pieces in between. But yeah, really bringing it back. It's Mike, what you were saying. GRC is a special beast, and a lot of us go running and screaming from the room as soon as those three letters are mentioned. So there's a lot of benefits in this. And I think that's what sort of, if nothing else, this document is good to get people to sort of think through, how could this be used in your organization? Or how did these groups, well, I don't want to say misuse it, but how could it be used in your organization? Let's stick with the positive light here.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I'm glad so bringing back to the document, one of the things that, I wanted to highlight here is that, yes, indeed, security is still struggling with what are effective metrics. But a document like this is at least effective communication. And in this case, as you're describing, it's very GRC, threat actor, threat vulnerability, business impacts, which I think is where security can add a lot of informative context. And the other thing that stood out to me was that if we look into controls, what are the difference, or how much are we trying to emphasize preventive versus detective or corrective controls? Because I'm thinking if we're shifting left and we just wanted to detect flaws earlier, we're possibly fighting a losing battle. That's not to say that there's not a place for SAST vulnerability testing early on, but more like doing having preventive controls are much better for me. And at a higher level, I'm thinking of things like one of my favorite go-to examples is of React. Rather than spending time testing for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in your front-end code at development time, just shift to or adopt, I'll use instead of our loaded word, a framework that just makes it really hard to have those types of vulnerabilities. And yes, there is quite a horrible alphabet soup of acronyms in here, but of the, some of them, it boils down to, a lot of them talk about threat modeling. And threat modeling is just one part of the API, how do they call it? The application and interface security. It's just one of many different controls. And that's where they call out threat modeling or OWASP top 10 style things. And the rest of it is very GRC heavy, but it gets into those important preventive controls like IAM, which is IAM and managing encryption are two very central themes throughout these breaches.
Yeah. And I think that's, as over the last year, I'm really starting to hear more and more folks talk about, or not so much talk about, but have, I'll say, sincere interest in IAM. From the cloud providers trying to figure out how to integrate IAM into their services a little more elegantly, down to maybe a startup that's trying to figure out, okay, we want to be able to support more than just what we're starting with. So it's interesting to see it being used in a lot of those areas, not being taught about. Probably a lot of other areas which can think about it at the enterprise side, which can do more with it than they're doing. And sort of tie that back a little bit over in Discord, the guys started riffing on the conversation a little bit, and to sort of bring it back between them and what you're talking about, infrastructure as code, and how do you actually, if you can actually codify what you're putting out there, does that help improve this shift to left? Is that a positive thing? How does that how does that itself play with IAM? I think those things can sort of integrate and work together, but you require a growing level of maturity to do some of these things possibly.
True. Yeah, I think that growing level of maturity, I want to say, just actually comes out of basic engineering capabilities. And I'll go to a bit more advanced example and say what would be fantastic is that if you're building your API that's very heavily Lambda driven, for example, or just functions as a service, you can actually put some very granular IAM policies along those specific function calls. So rather than granting all of this access to your blob of code that's your service or even a microservice, you can actually say this particular function actually only has write-only access to this data store, or read-only access, or this part of the code has access to encryption keys, but this part of the code doesn't actually have access to encryption keys because it's not operating on any of the data. So that, in my mind, is a fantastic, wonderful way to get to that. I suppose, what are we on, episode 1, 2, 3? By the time we're on episode 3, 2, 1, we might be halfway there, but that's sort of how the vision that I would lay out for getting this basically just engineering maturity that just so happens to have some security benefits.
Yeah, when they ranked these, I thought it was interesting, right? They compared this to some of their other survey results when they ranked this. Now, number 2 is the one we talk about a lot, which is misconfiguration, right? It's a misconfigured S3 bucket that creates the data breach. Data breach is 1, so it's what is really number 1? But anyways, and then there's a number here that weren't ranked in their survey results. So they've highlighted some stuff that I think is really important that other people haven't really ranked as a concern. So what does that tell me? Does it tell me people aren't thinking about cloud security and application security in the same way that we've been talking about it, which is things like misconfiguration, lack of cloud security architecture strategy, insufficient identity, credential access and key management, weak control plane, metastructure and applet structure failures, which is an interesting term, and then limited cloud usage visibility are all on this list, but not identified in any other of their surveys, which is kind of striking to me.
You almost got a bingo out of my card. Sorry. You're bringing up good points, and I think part of what might be going on here, we and I say we, the three of us, but we really tend to think, I think, a lot about application security and cloud, because that's sort of the world we live in, right? With my CSA hat on, they're obviously thinking about the cloud side of that. So that could be part of what we're seeing going on, those sort of two pieces coming together. A lot of the rest of the world that's looking at application security, they might not have a foggiest idea what a Lambda is in either the Python or an Amazon sense. So could that be causing part of that?
Maybe. But some of these issues don't go away even in a non-cloud environment. Misconfiguration can still happen in an on-prem, identity and access management, not having a good architecture. These are issues that are just not 100% cloud. Maybe cloud makes it more difficult, but these are things that I still think are important from an application security perspective.
But I don't think they bite you as hard if you're behind your enterprise firewall and you've misconfigured the, I don't know, Microsoft widget.
I think you're right. And this is where, for me, you have to go to a different PDF document from the CSA to figure out what the actual Egregious 11 are, or listen back to get, or email Matt, because he can rattle them off for you pretty effectively. But there is a bit of an overlap with the OWASP Top 10, the latest evolution of it. But I think, John, to your point, the OWASP Top 10 for me feels a little bit too tactical and focused on this particular application that may not actually have as a significant impact to your fundamental environment or to where your significant data stores are. Now, obviously, I think there could be, a SQL injection or a misconfiguration of a database that gets put onto, internet access. Obviously, I think we could make some cases that falls into an OWASP Top 10 item could hit it. But what stood out for me is that I liked how these were presented. I liked this document that puts out some case studies of the threats and explains this is how to consume this information from both a business perspective, talks about business impacts, talking about a GRC aspect, but there's also takeaways here that hopefully I think the DevOps team can recognize as insecure interfaces and APIs. Here's our weak control plane. When the DevOps team starts talking about north-south or east-west controls, this is the language they're starting to use, and this is also maybe where they can recognize that moving into the cloud, things can be really secure or suddenly really insecure because one IAM misconfiguration can be an SSRF on your WAF that pivots into a data store that exfiltrates data. So I think perhaps it's not so much OWASP Top 10 is narrowly focused because we're only thinking maybe of one application. This, I think, at least broadens or hopefully broadens the mindset to think about what does your whole environment look like and what could go wrong.
It's an interesting way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. So other thing is we're getting to the end here too. I did also want to highlight just to a little bit of emphasize that it's a great example of communication. So if you are a product security team perhaps, or just you're the cybersecurity team, this type of documentation might be helpful depending on if you need to have the communication with business, so your general management or your GMs of your product or that sort of CISO level. The other thing, though, is that it did have some wonderful language. If you scroll down to the Zoom entry, one of the technical impacts included general mayhem, which I just thought is a fantastic term to be using, and I'm going to start adopting that term in my writing.
Do they have an EE number on that? I missed that one.
No,
That'd be pretty awesome. It's EE11.
It's EE11, abuse and nefarious use of cloud services. So those of you with your thesauruses, this is great. This is a great writing exercise for the day.
Yes.
So I think if I could possibly summarize where we've going is that we're shifting left, but we're shifting left. Hopefully, vendors who are security vendors who are figuring out how to better integrate their tools leftwards, so to speak, into what DevOps teams are actually doing. So it's bringing them value. We're trying to figure out what are the metrics that are informing this. An easy metric, perhaps because it's available and is on the top of our minds, is vulnerability or defect count. But that's not giving us the whole picture. And even, John, as you brought that up, you were acknowledging that case too. And we're still struggling with patch management and a little bit of just asset inventory if we talk about third party. Where is our data going when it leaves our environment? So Basically, we're dealing with, except for the vendor integration, 2 out of 3 items are probably, security problems that we were dealing with at least 20 years ago, if not later.
Yeah, we're still dealing with them. We just need to start thinking about them a little differently. I think the opportunity to shift security left means we can make security part of the process instead of after the process. I mean, this was a fundamental part of my strategy when I was at Tenable, which is, why do we always have to wait for security to be at the end? Why can't we think about security and embedding security in along the way? Shifting left in DevSecOps gives us an opportunity if we embrace it. And I think the challenge is some of the legacy vendors are struggling, so they're slowing those orgs down that want to embrace security earlier in the process. And now you see a bunch of new innovation coming that's really starting to enable it for some organizations. And we've got this interesting fight going on, I think, in the space a little bit about who's going to win some of those battles. But it's important, Mike, I think, for us to really think about and continue to highlight on this show, because if you can embrace security earlier, you should be seeing better results with your code at the end of the day. And that's the real benefit of all this, if we can achieve it.
Yeah, if I can, take 30 seconds to step back here before we wrap up. There was an article, let me see if I can grab it real quick. I can talk to it. There was an article I didn't put in our show notes. InfoSec security. Most workers not interested in switching to a cybersecurity role. 60% thought they'd need more education. 27% thought they didn't know how to code. 26% thought it was too intimidating. The reason I mentioned this, we're in our little bubble here, right? And, Mike, and when I was in San Francisco, we're especially in a bubble, especially in Silicon Valley, right? So there's a lot of folks out there who, as I mentioned, the Lambda joke and stuff like that world is sort of Greek to them. Not alone a lot of stuff we've been talking about, shifting left. What the hell does that mean? And I think that's probably a large portion of things we need to think about as we sort of, chase this trend, which hopefully will go beyond a trend. But as we sort of chase this last year and next few years, what the hell is this DevSecOps thing? Automation, hell, we're lucky if we can get Make to run. Check-in code. I think our Subversion server is still up. So there's a lot of really things old. I don't want to say old, but things which are working just fine. So how do we expose what we're doing and have the conversations with those folks to get them to sort of catch up a little bit and be able to, comprehend what the hell we just talked about for the last half hour and be able to actually use a little bit more of that in what they're doing today. So I think that probably. It'd be interesting to see a metric like that. I mean, there's most of the reports we're seeing, which are, they're usually, let's be honest, guys, most of these reports we talk about are PR pieces which have been put out by a startup that's got a security product. Some of them are better than others. Ones like CSA are obviously a little less biased. But those vendors which are doing this stuff, are those reports which are coming out or tend to show that everyone is going towards AppSec. Is that really true? I'm guessing probably not. So how do we sort of think about the rest of the orgs out there? And then back to our metrics, sort of bringing it full circle, the ones who are having compromises and having a lot of bugs right now, are they actually putting efforts into this, or are they ones which we need to sort of get on board and shift left? Do we need to be shifting the organizations left or the processes within them?
I think that's a great point. One final thing I'd add to that is maybe those cloud engineering experts or just the developers who are becoming experts in cloud computing just actually happen to be doing security as a nature of their work, and they don't even realize it because they're building these controls fundamentally. So perhaps the shift left has already happened. We just actually have to acknowledge that the engineers have driven it because they're doing the day-to-day work, writing the code, and security is catching up. But either case, I think it's great. And speaking of being part of the process, I'm very glad that Matt and John, you've been part of the process for this segment. So I just don't go talking on my own and ranting off in many boring and monotone ways. Although at least was able to get over the Egregious 11. So with that tongue twister out of the way, want to thank Matt and John. Want to thank all of you for a great discourse in our Discord server. Go pay attention to that in the break because we need to take a break and return with news of the week.